Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to take a look at securing the Republic. The nation is now established, the Constitution is now in place, and it is time for all those things to be put to play as the nation reaches forward. So let's get started. April 30th, 1789. George Washington takes the first oath to the office of the presidency. Does this after being elected unanimously to the office. He is the only person ever to have done this. And this was groundbreaking, not just because of what it meant of a unanimous decision or that he was the first, but Washington had come out of retirement again to run as president. And he believed fervently that serving the people was the role of the citizenry, and this really was this wonderful icon that we can see. Up until this point, the person who's really in charge of the nation was the moderator of the Continental Congress, who also had the title president, but there's no executive branch prior to this point, so there's no international dealings, there's no big plays on the federal government, there's none of that existed. Now, the Constitution outlined all the criteria for the president at the time, which really was the powers that the office possessed, the significance of this individual, but some of the other casual things did not, what's his title, and it was knocked around for a long time. Some people wanted to go with your excellency, your highness, some of these are really long, your grand authority, of which in responsibility of the executive branch. Oh, heavens no. But it was ultimately just decided on Mr. President title and the gentlemanly honorific. After Washington after he was sworn in, he delivered a speech to the Congress that had assembled at the time, and there was a crowd of people to see this swearing in, but the speech that followed was seen by only about 100 people. It has been preserved for posterity, but this is a big difference from what happens nowadays, to say the least. In the early years, we see that Washington's cabinet is made up of a who's who of significant early Americans, and the power of the president is really, really large, so it's way too much for one person to do. It is thus divided up into different individuals who can kind of advise on a topic and be experts on a subject, and that way the final decision making is not left, while the president does have the final decision making process, he is aided by some of the best people around him. The vice president is John Adams, who was a big proponent of the republic style of government that we would come to see. He had been a diplomat to England for a while. We see Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, and he had been in France for the past several years trying to get their people in a better state. There was movements towards the French Revolution at this time. Jefferson was there kind of coaxing some things along. Hamilton becomes the Secretary of Treasury. He had been responsible for running trading networks in his youth and was an instrumental part of Washington's Revolutionary War years, so we really don't see a surprise that he would show up again. General Henry Knox becomes Secretary of War. He was one of the grand leaders during the Revolutionary War. And then John Jay, who was a author of the Federalist Papers and early Federalist scholar himself, would become the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The executive branch itself, in its early days, was comprised of 3 different departments. The cabinet positions like this were really, 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 really minimum because, well, at the time the government was really, really, really small, and it was believed that you needed those people right then and there because that's what you have. I mean, nowadays we've got 14 members of the president's cabinet, but at this time, just the 3. A Department of War that will defend the nation, the Department of State, which is responsible for international relations, and the Treasury Department that oversees finances. The Attorney General position would also be created a few years later to advise the president on the legality of some of the decisions that would be made. And then the role of the Postmaster General was also created to head up the postal system, which isn't just, getting letters from A to B. It's also about mail circulation and news circulation too. So these are some fantastically significant roles that we see. Now, when the new nation got going, one of the biggest problems we saw was based on the problem of the Articles of Confederation not being able to tax people, not being able to generate revenue. So the early United States has this fantastic debt problem. They have a lot of it. From the Revolutionary War years until now, each state just kind of gave however much they felt like giving to the cause or the nation. And that was not really a great long-term idea, because the fear was that individual states would want to give less and less. Or if you see that one state gives a significantly larger amount, either A, you might decide, I don't want to pay that much, or B, I have to pay way more because I want to match that individual. So fixing the debt, fixing the tax problems was by far one of the grandest problems that our early nation had. Hamilton had developed a new plan for the Treasury Department, and it included, first, absorbing all states' debts. No state owed more than any other state. Every state would go on to be part of the larger national debt. And this would balance the debt across the entire nation. It's no longer the debt of North Carolina or Georgia or Pennsylvania. It is the national debt. Second, a bank for the United States would be created. Now, prior to this, like we'd seen, individual states would print individual money for that state, and then you'd go from Texas to Oklahoma, and then you'd have to change your currency. Then from Oklahoma to Kansas, you'd have to change it again. This is what the dollar is going to look like, what it stands for, what it's based on. Hamilton also establishes the excise tax, taxes on stuff that is manufactured here. And we see that tariffs are going to be established and created to create money for industries. So if something is bought from a foreign market, an extra tax is paid to that. The goal is, if I have to pay more for something that is made in England than I do for something made in the United States, then my American businesses, my American industries, my American developments can happen. And this plan was really very thought out. But, with any good plan, there's gonna be problems with it. There's people who are gonna stand up to it and say that's not going to happen, and that would lead to the creation of political parties. We also see that that Hamilton's work here would lead to the idea of a national standing army, as opposed to the local state militias that had preceded that. The big push against Hamilton was the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, and this was based along the idea, first saying putting a tariff on imported goods hurts foreign trade. And for Jefferson, he believed that it was going to affect not just industry, but agriculture. A lot of the people who supported Jefferson were from the South, had made their money and made their livelihoods through agriculture. Some cases were big plantations, other was just the local farmer. Hamilton, though, he had always been from the North. Really, his time pre-revolutionary through the Revolution, even afterwards, he is a New York man. and trade had always been a major thing there. This clash really went over one of the big questions: what's the basis of the American dollar going to be? Is it going to be based on trade, or is it going to be based on agriculture? And this whole time, people, while both sides are arguing what's the best way to move forward, how this plan should go, people are buying up land grants and speculating on the value of the dollar for almost nothing, knowing they're going to be able to pay off these bonds at a fortune. The question over what Hamilton and Jefferson both wanted elaborated more than just economics. It also included the Constitution itself. Hamilton believed that what he was doing, what he wanted to do, was absolutely within the confines of the Constitution because of the wording of that first sentence, the power of the Congress to enact laws for the general welfare. Now, that doesn't say what those laws are or are not. And this elastic clause, the idea that, well, it doesn't say what it is or isn't, so I'm going to take it and infer it to mean this. That's something that he did. Jefferson believed that, no, the Constitution says right here that the power of the Congress is blah, 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 blah. If it doesn't say it, it's not there. Washington sides with Hamilton on this one. And a deal is struck. Now, neither side was happy that it had to come to this, but we see that Hamilton's plan needed to go forward for the economy to become stronger. Jefferson was really intransigent on the plan, but agrees to support it under the compromise that the nation's capital would be in the South. They were knocking around ideas of where to put the new capital. Would it be in New York like it had previously been? What about Philadelphia? Okay, that's not a bad idea. But it was decided that an entirely new district would be created, the District of Columbia, a city that also operated like its own little state, like almost its own little nation, that straddled between Maryland and Virginia. And the agreement was that, yes, this is where we'll put the capital. In exchange, Jefferson agrees to support the plan. Washington was the one who picked the actual specific site of the future Capitol building, and according to legend, he was the one responsible for laying the keystone at the center of it, which, that's kind of cool. 1789, the French Revolution begins, and the French Revolution was like the American Revolution, and there were a lot of things that led up to it. We're not going to go into too much detail about it because that's not something we can cover in this time frame. But when it happens and the people, the oppressed people of France, which is about 95% of the population, rise up against the last 5% of the population, that included an old aristocracy, nobility, bad tax problems, a lot of bad problems. Here stateside, we were like, wow, this is exciting. This is great. We're seeing that, these people are fighting for the same ideals that we fought with. And, good for them. That's fantastic. But the French and the English, they had never really liked each other, like at all. And they had nearly fought on numerous different occasions. And this was just one time that the British declare war on France because France starts caving in on itself. For the first couple months of the revolution, there's a lot of French Revolution, there's a lot of paper victories where like the king agrees to give more power to the people, a king agrees to tax everyone equally. But things start escalating after about a year when the French put their king on trial and execute him. And then they put their queen on trial, and then they execute her. And this time period in France called the Reign of Terror occurs, where anybody was being accused of crimes against the state, where you could be sent to the gallows just for calling someone monsieur, madame, instead of citizen. It really was that extreme. And when there's no authority in France, when there's no government that you can say, okay, who's in charge of France right now, and no one has an answer, this is where we start distancing ourselves from France. Despite the fact that they had been helping us during the Revolutionary War. At this point, things are so wild over there, we can do very little. In 1793, Washington issues a proclamation of neutrality. We're not getting involved in this at all. We're not helping the French. We're not helping the British. And when the French envoy Edmund Gennett arrives in that same year, he comes from a nation that is really thoroughly divided. He both speaks for the state and the people, which is fantastic. But he starts commissioning, which is a fancy way of saying paying American ships. And this is a time before the United States even had a navy. So these are just ships that just might happen to have a cannon on it, or say, okay, you bring the ship, we'll put guns on the boat. He wants Americans and American ships to act as privateers, which is piracy. He says that these people, if they want to do it, they'll be paid handsomely. They'll get to fight the British, and oh, we don't like the British either. So this seemed like a really stirring idea. When Washington hears about this, he is just aghast because, we've said we're going to be neutral. We do not want to be brought into this conflict. We do not want there to be talkings with French Revolution when there's no clear view of who's even in charge of France. And when England hears this, and they hear that we are trading with the French, and we are not trading with France itself, we're trading with like French Canada and Saint-Domingue and the Caribbean Isles, the British start impressing U.S. soldiers, which is where the British basically seize the ship, take everyone as a crew on a British ship, and you could almost call it enslave them to work for the British Navy. This is really freaking wild. In 1794, John Jay, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, outlines a treaty saying that we would not ally with France at all. That at this point forward, we were not going to stand with France. This one move, just saying we're not staying with France, moves us closer to England, which was not super popular for a lot of people. I mean, by this point, the idea of you're moving us closer to England, weren't we at war with them not too long ago? Wait, you're moving us closer to England? Aren't they the people who are kidnapping sailors? Why are you doing this? And England agrees to a concession. They'll allow us to keep on shipping stuff. They'll end the impressment policy, and they'll even leave the forts in the Northwest. So they'll basically leave their entire military position in what is now America to us. We also say that's fine, and we agree to pay some debts to England that we had incurred prior to the war. These were trade debts. It's not like we agreed to pay for all the tea we threw in the harbor. People were furious about this because, well, for a lot of people, they viewed that we were helping to suppress another revolution. We were helping to keep free folks down. This might not have been that popular, but we avoided war with England in doing this. Jefferson sees and believes that this was a really bad idea. I mean, he had been in France for the past several years of the 1780s. He wasn't here when Washington was elected. He wasn't here for a swearing-in process. He shows up and is told, oh, BT Dubs, your Secretary of State, get to New York. And he has a great fondness for France. Hearing that the Americans are not going to back the French, hearing that his country that he loves so much and the country that is his home are actively against each other, he decides to hire out this publisher of a guy that's his name is Philip Frenro, and Frenro in his newspaper makes attacks on Washington, makes attacks on Hamilton. And these begin as, look at what the president is doing, look at what the Secretary of Treasury is doing. And then they start escalating in how rude and crude they are, and they start talking about both of these guys in a personal setting. And that was something that just wasn't done. Now, I know this might seem kind of odd to think, wait a minute, we see politicians dragging each other through the mud all the time. What's the big deal? The big deal is this was the first time it had really happened in the United States. His attacks ultimately even were so bad that Jefferson, the guy who hired him, realized we have gone too far and kind of called him off. But this is another step towards the political division which we would see. And at the end of the 18th century, there are really two different political parties that are arising. We've got the Federalists and the Republicans. And I really have to stress this with everything in me. These Republicans and modern Republicans, the only commonality that they share is the name. It's not like you can say, okay, well, I don't see the Democrats there. Oh, that must be the Federalists. No. The modern parties and these have very little in common. Now, like as you're looking at this list, you're probably noticing a couple already. And if not, don't worry. Over the course of this class, we'll discuss how these political parties changed over time. So, today we took a look at the early presidency of General Washington. We took a look at Hamilton's economic policy and plans and what was happening to the French and American reaction to that. So, I hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.